Hello everyone, you're very welcome to the virtual festival of LGBTI plus history, Outing the Past Dublin 2021, hosted by three of the capital's most popular cultural institutions. The National Museum of Ireland, Decorative Arts and History, the National Gallery of Ireland and Kilmainham Jail Museum are delighted to present Outing the Past Dublin 2021, which runs from the 22nd to the 28th of March 2021. The festival aims to bring LGBTI plus history to a wider audience in an exciting, inspiring and thought-provoking programme of events. As part of the festival programme, I would like to introduce Dan Vo, a Victoria and Albert ambassador and founder of the volunteer-led LGBTQ plus tours at the museum. Dan is currently a freelance museum consultant for LGBTQ plus programming at the National Gallery and Tate Britain. During lockdown, he was the host of Museum from Home, a daily interview on Twitter Live with museum professionals, which was picked up for broadcast on BBC Arts and was #1 trending in the UK on Twitter on April 30th, 2020. Titled Breaking Down Barriers, Dan will deliver a live presentation of original research conducted with 50 galleries, libraries, archives, museums across the UK engaged in LGBTQ plus programming. Dan will also be joined by Kris Reid for a Q&A session. Kris Reid is a PhD candidate at Ulster University. His research focuses on museum-based activism within the context of LGBTQ plus heritage, exploring the pathways and barriers towards museum engagement with issues of social justice.
Hello everybody, it's a delight to be with you and live as well, so thank you very much for having me. It's a thrill to be part of Outing the Past and wonderful to be invited by the National Museum of Ireland to come along and present with you, and I'm delighted that Kris Reid will be joining me as well. Now I've got some slides that I'm going to share with you to sort of talk you through some of the early stages of what I'd like to explore with you, which is the start of a wonderful new project which is called Queer Heritage and Collections Network. So if we've got the slides up, I'll start to talk you through it, but it is a wonderful organization that is part of a project that has been launched by 5 key organizations, and it is Historic Royal Palaces, English Heritage, Historic England, also the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries, and it's sort of an explorer of the ways in which we can connect across the UK and beyond the UK as well, and have a look at the ways in which we can break down those barriers. And so that's very much what the presentation is going to be about. It's going to be about some of the early research that has been coming up as part of the project. And so it's a delight to have you with me to talk through some of that. So if we do have the slides, that would be wonderful to pop up. And just to kind of lead you into it, I will be speaking with Kris Reid, who is one of the key researchers for the organization as well. So Kris has been part of the research team. We've also got Lucy Whitehead, who is really important and integral because both of them are conducting lots of research for us that will be quite useful for the future of the project. Fabulous. Thank you very much, Ashley. So here are our handles. So if you want to get in touch with us, it's for me and Kris Reid. And as I've said, we are a wonderful network that is new. We literally was given birth to in the middle of lockdown 1 here in the UK. And it was thanks to Art Fund, but we've also got some new funding, which is very exciting. I can share with you. You are the first audience that I'll be sharing this information with. We've also just recently been confirmed that we've received funding from the National Heritage Lottery Fund as well, so quite significant. And I'll tell you what that means for us going into the future as well. But if we go to the next slide, please. This is what I miss the most about what we do in museums. I have been running the V&A LGBTQ plus tours as a volunteer and as a coordinator, a co-coordinator of the team. And of course, this is the sort of thing that we miss the most. This is one of the fantastic audiences that came along to our tour for the V&A's LGBTQ plus tour. And for me, the remarkable thing about the museum is the fact that there is no queer corner to our museum. The history is across all parts of the galleries of the museum, and it's about going into the collections and digging up the stories, and it's about sharing the stories that we find. And it's about the existence of LGBTQ plus lives and history across place, time, and culture. And then we go to the next slide, please. This is the wonderful team that I get to work with a few extra friends from other collections that are part of the a research meeting here. We regularly gather each month to kind of hone in on our skills. We recently had one in lockdown as well, and we continue to have them as well. It's just a way of kind of making sure that we are abreast of what's happening and making sure that we get to share the research with each other. And I think that's a very key ethos of the Queer Heritage Collections Network as well. It's about how do we make sure that what we do isn't siloed, and we can make sure that it goes across different organizations. But here, as you can see, the team is wonderful. And for me, I believe that it's very much the idea that a more diverse team that you can work with, the more diverse the stories that we end up sharing. And as you can see from the previous slide, the audience that you bring in and invite and will come to see you is also very diverse. And that inclusion is at the very heart of the very first project that I did in LGBTQ plus history and heritage, very much the V&A. It has expanded, of course, but if we go to the next slide, for me, the core of it is an idea that is rooted very deeply in my own story, which is I come from a refugee family, and here is the refugee flag at the V&A Museum. And it's bright orange like the life jacket. The black stripe is like the buckle that you would secure it to yourself. And it's supposed to represent the tens of thousands, the millions even, of people who are currently seeking refuge, traversing borders like that black stripe. It's also a border, traversing borders to find new homes. And for me, it's an important reminder of the legacy of that British colonialism, in which that violent contact that happened across the world, it imposed laws across the world as well, where it introduced anti-homosexual laws. And there is a real key impact in the way that we share LGBTQ plus history and heritage in our collections, and the way that that can actually impact our understanding of the diversity of gender and sexuality in the past prior to that colonial contact, and therefore help with activists on the ground in different countries around the world at the moment, seeking reform around the world. And if we go to the next slide, for me, it's a thrill to be with you, because I would have done this talk last year, but of course I couldn't because we all went into lockdown. But I never imagined that we would be sort of progressing to a new level. We're just coming to the very last week of teaching at the V&A at the moment for a queer history of objects. So we'll manage to launch a brand new program that talks very much about that rich history, and very much about how we can use that history to understand our social context today, and understand how we can use that history to remap our future and look at reform. And I'm delighted, next slide please, to be able to take some of those learnings and build it into the Queer Heritage Collections Network, but also work with so many wonderful organizations across the UK and beyond, and explore that idea of how our collections have an opportunity to map and change the communities around us. And this is just a wonderful example of the people who have already come on board and been part of our story. As I said, we started in lockdown. Well, we've brought in about 60 organizations now. That's 60 organizations from across the UK and beyond. And these are some of the people who were involved in our first symposium, in our first lectures, in our first sharing of the research. And if we go to the next slide, I'll be able to introduce you to some of the steering group. We've got the wonderful people who make up the key representatives of the organizations involved. On the left side, you've got Matthew Story from Historic Royal Palaces. You've got Dominic Brichard, Dr. Dominic Brichard at the very top from English Heritage. Tate Greenhalgh is now taken over as representative for the National Trust here in the UK. In the center of that cluster on the left, you've got Richard Sandell, Professor Richard Sandell from the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries, and Sean Curran is now our representative at Historic England. On the right-hand side, you can see, I've already mentioned Lucy in black and white there, and also Kris, you'll meet shortly. And in the middle, it's Rachel Lennon and myself. We are the co-project managers of this fantastic new project. And if we go to the next slide, I'd like to share a quote from Rachel, because Rachel very much led on Prejudice and Pride, the National Trust, which was a pivotal moment, I think, in the way in which British collections explored the history and that relation to decriminalisation in this country. It was the 50th anniversary of partial decriminalisation in England and Wales in 2017. And the programme that Rachel led on was astronomical in the way that it helped explore it. And for Rachel, it is our responsibility to continue to look again and to research, to better understand the lives lived in connection to its places and objects, and to ask who is remembered and who is forgotten, and to understand the power behind those choices. And I think that this is something that I hold very dearly in terms of as a way of thinking about new collections as we approach them, as we start to explore them, as we start to work with the teams, and we start to work with communities that are around those teams in exploring queer history and heritage in collections. And next slide, please. And just a recognition to all the sponsors and all the people who participated. If you take a screenshot of this, you'll be able to have a look at all the wonderful people involved in that first symposium. But I'm going to show you a very quick video now, coming up in the next slide, which is, I think, the very first project that we presented in the symposium. And I'll talk you through a few projects leading up to the most recent project. So coming up next is a video that was presented as part of Prejudice and Pride. It will be a video that you'll see that has David McAlmont as the performer, and also Professor Richard Sandell speaking, as well as Julie Howell, who both collectively worked with Rachel on a brilliant program, as well as E.J. Scott, who you may know as the founder and curator of the Museum of Transology as well.
Over the last couple of years, more museums and galleries have brought out their queer or LGBTQ histories than ever before, which has been fantastic to have that spotlight on hidden or suppressed or silenced histories. But we realise how important they are, because at the same time there has been a backlash, a public and press backlash against some of that visibility, and there's been rising hate crime against LGBTQ people, which makes us realise how important it is to tell these stories in these kinds of places today.
Places of heritage, culture can do a lot more for changing behaviours and supporting people to see things differently.
Desire to know, desire. What makes a child a child?
Fabulous. So we've got wonderful credits. So thank you very much, Aisling, for manning the deck at the moment, really pushing the technology. But it is brilliant to be able to show you the video. And coming up to the next, when we do get to the next slide, it is very much, as I've said, David McAlmont going into the collections and exploring those collections. And it is great to be able to do that, in working with an artist to be able to fill the gaps in the history that we might not necessarily have written down. And so that idea of using imagination to enliven the history is brilliant. And another organization that does that really well, I think one of the best organizations in terms of doing live performance as part of interpretation of queer history, is of course Historic Royal Palaces, and the Queer Lives at the Tower, and also the Queer Lives that was going to be at Hampton Court Palace as well, is a significant project that really opens up the history by using theatre and performance, and by using the ways in which artists can write those gaps, by creating these stories that allow us to immediately connect with history. I think is quite significant. And to kind of jump through the slides that I would be showing you, it would be to also talk about Historic England and the fabulous Pride of Place project that really helped map the story of LGBTQ history in place, and being able to share now the research that Alison Oram and Justin Bengry led on, to be able to look at how we might start picking that up in a more localized way. And it's something that the National Heritage Lottery Fund, that funding that we've just received, I hope will be able to help us expand that and to explore that a little bit more in terms of the way that we can map history. And to also be able to talk to you about a really exciting project that is, let me just see if I can take you through some of those slides. So that is Dave McElmont. I believe the place here is in Plasnewith, and also this is the drag raven that would have been involved in part of the Historic Royal Palace's Queer Lives at the Tower tours. We were just talking about historic England and the wonderful pins that they placed into the map across England, specifically England, but it was done co-curated, and so of course it meant that we looked into the community and asked the community to also tell us what their memories are. What were the places they frequented, and what are the things they would like us to remember as well? And so that was a remarkable project where tens of thousands of locations were pinned and considered queer significant. And I come to now a wonderful project, which is Shout Out Loud by English Heritage, which was working with young people to tell the stories of the place. And here we have a performer who is just brilliant, who is involved in that, taking the story of England, Edward II, who was at Eltham Palace, a historic England place, and turning it into a performance, a immersive theatre performance, which people could walk through and see. And these are some of the examples that we introduced as part of the symposium in order to share best practice with 60 organizations. And this is just about 50 of them, but there's about 10 I need to add to this board, but about 60 organizations that are across the UK that are wanting to do similar work. And right now, a lot of that funding that we've received will be looking to see how we can share and connect up organizations, how we can encourage those that are further forward to mentor other organizations that would like to jump into this exciting work. And a lot of the conversations that I've had with all the incoming organizations, about 60 incoming organizations, that's about 60 discussions that I've had with these different organizations, there have been a sort of cluster of themes that have come up and emerged. And this very much was what we did for our very first symposium in January. And the funding that we've received now will ensure that we have another symposium in next year and the year after, in order to be able to continue to explore the importance of how we ensure there's good LGBTQ plus engagement in programming, how we can bolster the way in which collections record this and the processes in which that's done, and also look at how we can break down those barriers, look at regional and national boundaries. And as I mentioned, the symposium is very much, the program is available. I'm going to drop it into the chat so that you can access them, and then have a look at the final video, which I would like to show, but I think I might just leave for now. So I think if I can invite Kris now to come onto the session, because Kris is going to give you a bit of an insight into some of the early research that's been happening as part of the Queer Heritage Collections Network as well.
Thanks, Dan. So you've just had a really beautiful, colourful presentation from Dan, and I'm now going to talk to you about a literature review, which is just going to completely set your hearts on fire. But actually, you know, as somebody who personally, throughout my life, have really opposed and not liked writing literature reviews, this was possibly one of the most interesting projects that I've gotten to work on. So I'm really, really excited to have the opportunity to share it with you. And I hope that you feel the same way. So if you just give me 1 second, I will open my PowerPoint. Okay. Dan, can you see that okay?
I certainly can.
Great. Okay. So I'm just going to run through it, and this links very closely to what Dan has already spoken about. But this was essentially a piece of work that was conducted for the Queer Heritage and Collections Network by myself and Professor Richard Sandell, who Dan already mentioned, and is co-director of the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries at the University of Leicester. And through this project or this piece of work, we wanted to collate the existing literature on the subject of LGBTQ plus or queer museum practice, and tease out the main themes that emerge. And the literature on this subject has grown exponentially in the last couple of decades, and certainly in the past 5 years or so. And by doing this work, we hope that we've put together a useful document that highlights some of the key successes, but also the ongoing challenges needing addressed within the sector. And I think in the link Dan is going to share, you'll be able to access the document as well. So please feel free to read and use it at your leisure. So when we were doing this research into what's already been written, two sort of overarching themes emerged that we wanted to drill into in a bit more detail. So the first looked at interpreting LGBTQ plus history and queering museum collections. And this really focuses on the specific approaches museums have taken to queer their collections and practices. And within this, there were a number of sub-themes that started to emerge. The first we look at discusses overcoming the queer language barrier. And this really focuses on the search for the sort of correct or appropriate use of language when discussing this group, which at the moment it doesn't have a definitive answer, but there are certainly a number of approaches that have been taken and can be used. The second looks at queer intersectionality, and in this, the literature is calling for a more nuanced approach to queer curatorship that better explores the diversity of queer lived experiences. So by that we mean not just looking at white, cisgendered, upper class experiences, which is something that I have certainly been guilty of myself in my own work. The third looks at representations of queer women, specifically in museum display. And this highlights the particular challenges faced by museums when attempting to engage with the history of queer women, not least of all the dominance of male perspectives in the historical record, but also the erasure of women more generally in the museum space. The fourth discusses deconstructing heteronormativity and homonormativity. So heteronormativity refers to the ingrained assumption that every individual or associated object encountered by visitors to the museum is heterosexual or cisgender, unless evidence is presented to the contrary. Whilst homonormativity enforces this perceived ideal of what a queer identity should look like, which again is often influenced by the dominance of heterosexuality and cis identities in our society. The fifth section looks at queer collections development and queering existing collections. So this section really unpicks some of the routes towards interpreting and publicly representing queer lives. And the final section of this sort of overarching theme focuses on trans voices. Within the literature on queer museum practice, trans voices are often forgotten, or certainly they're minimized. I can't remember who said it, but there is a quote that says that the T in LGBT is often silent, and this is certainly still the case in some museum practice. So this section really seeks to address the need for museums to react to the growing social and political oppression faced by transgender people specifically. So the second overarching theme, queer heritage in the public realm, looks at how these interpreted LGBTQ plus stories and themes are presented and received by both visitors and the wider population, and also how these narratives are discussed in the public realm. And I'm going to go into a little bit more depth with this section because I think some of the themes that come up are really important and relevant to any future work museums might consider engaging in. So the first looked at UK regional particulars. And I should say that while much of the literature in this review is UK focused, the arguments made are applicable to other domains, as Dan has already highlighted. And the first section I've just discussed previously is very rich in theory, but what it perhaps misses sometimes is a focus on the specific needs of different regions in terms of LGBTQ plus rights advocacy. So for example, much of the literature discussing the UK tends to generalize all four of the nations, and indeed the regions within those nations, as one entity. But what's very clear is that the experience of a museum in Liverpool will be very different to one in Aberdeen, and different again to one in Derry, with each of these places being influenced by its own social, economic and political conditions. So if we take Northern Ireland, for example, legislation such as the 2010 UK Equality Act, which is often cited as a reason for museums to engage with LGBTQ plus themes, doesn't apply in Northern Ireland. Politically, the devolved government is co-led by a party that is very hostile towards LGBTQ plus rights. And the region's identity as a post-conflict society has meant queer identities are often forgotten or certainly not prioritised in the development of legislation and some museum programming as well. So whilst I'm focusing on the UK and Northern Ireland there, the same things can be said, for example, in Ireland within different regions, not just geographically, but also looking at that rural-urban divide as well. And it certainly just means that LGBTQ plus people will all experience similar forms of oppression, but also different forms of oppression depending on their locale. And I think that we should be aware of this when we're developing LGBTQ plus programming. So I just wanted to give a very quick example of my own experience of trying to engage with this theme in Northern Ireland and through the work we've been doing at Hillsborough Castle in County Down, which is managed by historic royal palaces. Unfortunately, this work hasn't been able to take place for the past year or so, but fingers crossed it'll be coming back soon. But for anybody that hasn't heard of Hillsborough, just very quickly, I'm sure some people listening have endured me rabbiting on about Hillsborough Castle before, but it is the official residence of the British monarch and the British Secretary of State in Northern Ireland, and it opened fully to the public in 2019. And that same year, we launched an LGBTQ plus tour of the castle, which in normal times runs on the last Saturday of every month, but hopefully we'll be getting back to it soon. And one of the things we wanted to achieve with this was to acknowledge the contemporary injustice faced by LGBTQ plus people locally, but also where this sits in a global context. So while we discuss really fun, interesting stories associated with Hillsborough's queer past, we are bringing visitors back to the present as well. So some of the themes we explore during the tour include homophobia, the impact of British colonialism on LGBTQ plus rights, mental health in the LGBTQ plus community, particularly in Northern Ireland, and representations of queer identity in the media. And we weave these narratives into the tour, using our collections, as well as recognisable figures associated with Hillsborough. So one piece we used is this painting of William of Orange, which we used to discuss contemporary attitudes to LGBTQ plus rights in Northern Ireland. And we also have this painting of Lord Hillsborough on the left, who was a friend of Anne Lister's, also known as Gentleman Jack, on the right. And we use this to discuss the erasure of queer stories from the record more generally, but specifically looking at women's stories as well. And it's really hoped that the tour can help change fixed perceptions people may have of the past. And I think that's one of the most powerful things that queer museum practice can do, is to challenge people to reconsider really ingrained mindsets and to share in LGBTQ plus history that it is for all of us. Like what Dan said about the V&A, it isn't in a corner, it's everywhere. It's part of all of our story, and it's as important and relevant as any other group in history. Just moving on then to carry on from where I was, and this next point relates quite well. The next theme looked at LGBTQ plus rights advocacy and activism. And this is the need for museums to actively challenge social and political injustice, particularly for the oppressed minority groups we serve. In this instance, museums have the capacity to not merely represent a marginalized group, but to actively advocate for their rights. And instead of taking a neutral position on a subject that might be deemed to be too political, we can instead stand firm in our support of human rights. And I think this is a really big growth area for all of us working in museums. The third and penultimate theme is looking around at organizational resilience and values. And again, this consistently emerges in the literature. This aversion to risk and controversy can act as an impediment to the development of queer programming. And academics and museum professionals have suggested that we should be prepared to defend well-researched, ethically informed human rights work in our spaces, because with some themes, the potential for controversy is inevitable and should be expected. And finally, trans voices, and this comes up in both of the wider themes. As we felt, particularly at the moment, there is a need to address the absence of trans voices in our museums, and indeed in the literature on the subject as well. There's a lot of work to be done across the sector when it comes to queer lives generally, but we certainly need to do more to interpret and advocate trans voices more effectively. And this section of the literature review delves into that theme in a bit more detail. So hopefully I haven't bored you all to death, and hopefully you all take a chance to read through this, because it is really interesting stuff, and it's not my work. It is highlighting the work that has taken place. It really was exciting and a real privilege to get to work on this. I think particularly to see how exponentially these pieces of literature have grown. I mentioned in the past couple of decades, but even in the past 5 years, we're seeing more and more really exciting work coming out. And especially here in Ireland as well, there are so many exciting projects taking place. The National Museum of Ireland being one example, as well as internationally. And for anybody interested in engaging in this work, there is a wealth of advice out there on how best to approach this theme in our spaces. It's certainly changed my own approach to how I'm going to be doing things at Hillsborough Castle, and I certainly can't wait until we can all get back and do this work. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. I will stop sharing and hand back to Dan.
Thank you. Well, I think we come to the Q&A section now. So I'd like to invite everybody who would like to please do drop in questions that you may have into the chat, either the chat here on the right or the chat in the, it is on your right where it says top chat. We've already got some wonderful comments coming in. Kate Drenan has said, this is awesome, with a big smiley face. Also, Helen Beaumont has messaged in to sort of say it's a informative and thought-provoking presentation. So thank you very much. And hopefully we'll get some questions that will help to expand these ideas. I've got another message in that has come in. I think this one's for you, Kris, because it says, I hate doing literature reviews, but so interesting to hear about them. I mean, how did you start off with the literature review? Where did you, and because you and Richard kind of have co-authored it. It is available in the link that I've dropped in on your behalf as well. So everyone go to the symposium program, scroll down, you'll find the literature review. You'll also find links to any of the sessions that were held as part of that symposium, so you can actually watch them for yourself, and including the Our House video that I highly encourage to watch, because it is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful program that, a little trailer that I would have liked to have shown you. But Kris, I mean, where did you start?
Well, I'm quite lucky when I started, in the sense that I'm engaging with a lot of this work in my own PhD research, and Richard Sandell is just a fount of knowledge when it comes to this stuff. So the two of us sat down and had a really big brainstorm around, okay, what are some of the themes that might come out of this? But of course, we're going to come at this with our own lived experiences and our own attitudes. So what we did was then share this out with the network, who then fed back their thoughts on what else we could tease out and what certain themes could be included in the literature review. And then from there, it was just the task of doing a literature review, which is just reading as much as you possibly can. And I was kind of joking when I said I hate doing literature reviews. They are something that are so useful, and every time I do them, I'm so glad I did them, but the process can be quite painful. Whilst with this, it was a real treat, and it has influenced my own practice completely. So if anybody does have the time, I would encourage you to read it. As I say, it's not my work; it's the work of other people that we're just highlighting. And it's mostly UK examples. There's some American examples in there, but I think that all of those can be completely applicable to what everybody can do in their own spaces.
And in terms of picking up the idea of breaking down barriers, for me, there are some interesting things that are going to be happening as part of the centenary of Northern Ireland, and we're going to be looking at some of the stories that actually can be that require a lot of sensitivity. That requires, there's a challenge, there's a challenge to the ways in which we should address them. And so I wondered if we can kind of start with that idea, but pick up a question that's coming from Evan, Kris, which is just to say, can you give a bit more detailed example of the querying the history at Hillsborough? I love the examples that you gave, but I'd like to just hear maybe one more in detail.
Yeah, sure. I'll give you one that's quite fun, because this is a good example of how queer stories can kind of pop up in unexpected places. So we have been doing lots of research on the tour. I've been working on it with the curatorial team and the public engagement team at Hillsborough, and we had a really lovely tour written and we were kind of ready to go with it. And then one evening, one of my colleagues was watching Gentleman Jack when it was on TV, and out of nowhere, she just heard somebody say the name Lord Hillsborough, and she was like, where's that come from? So we started doing some research into Anne Lister's correspondence, and we found that her and the fourth Marquess of Downshire, when he was still Lord Hillsborough, had a really, really detailed correspondence with one another, and we found that they had actually travelled through Denmark together, and all these really interesting things, which we'd only really started researching before lockdown happened. But one of the things we saw was that they would cross borders together, and on their passports or their documents, it would be written that she was his wife or his companion. They wrote letters to each other discussing the Princess of Denmark and how beautiful she was. So we want to delve more into that. But I love that example, because there's a painting of him that hangs in the dining room at Hillsborough. It's the image I showed. It's a really gorgeous painting. And we had no idea that this narrative was there. And all the other research we've done has been based on us as a team and also community groups that have come in, and what they have seen that jumped out as queer, but also things that I had known from my own research that we could connect to the collection. But that one in particular, I think, it's an example of how these stories are there, they exist. And I don't like to use the word hidden, because they're not hidden, they're there, but the way they've been interpreted or researched hasn't called for them to be publicly presented until now. So that's a really fun one, but you should have seen our group chat that night when we found out that Lord Hillsborough was on Gentleman Jack. It was mad. It was mad. But please come on the tour, and you can hear all the stories as soon as we're allowed to open again.
What's your go-to WhatsApp emoji when you're excited or thrilled?
Oh gosh, I'm guiltily a monkey emoji person, which I need to adjust,
Well, we've got Carmel, who has sent in just a wonderful set of emojis for us. So there's a green heart, thanks emoji, pink hearts, and purple hearts. So lots of hearts, I think, effectively. Evan has said, I can't wait to visit after another lockdown. So I think you've inspired Evan to visit, who is based in Dublin as well. He says hello from Dublin. Francis has sort of said, interesting. And just picking up a few more, that's amazing from Laura's. That's specifically to do with the Anne Lister story, I think. But can we pick up that idea where you've said, here is a story that we found because it is written in the hand of the two people at the time. So Lord Hillsborough and also Anne Lister. But what happens when you've got a story that requires a bit of the community to come in to help tell that story? And I don't know if I should pick up on a particular story, but I wonder if we can kind of maybe talk about his name's just skipped my mind very briefly, but you've already mentioned William of Orange, but there's oh gosh, who am I thinking of when I'm thinking about it's the Black Diaries of Roger Casement.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry. Do you mind? Can we pick up on that as a case study and sort of explore how that particular narrative might require a bit of working with the community in order to interpret and tell?
Yeah, I think that Roger Casement's a really, really interesting one, because I don't know, I'm not an expert on Roger Casement, and I won't claim to be at all, but I've looked at Roger Casement myself within the context of William of Orange, bizarrely, because it's this whole idea of how we interpret queer lives, as you said, Dan. And I think that Roger Casement's a funny one, because the narratives around the Black Diaries have been so contested throughout the 20th century. And I think the majority of researchers now agree that they are his hand. They were written in his hand, so that they are real. But there's other narratives around, for example, the age of the people he's talking about, which can be quite complicated, and how we interpret those. What would be unacceptable in society, essentially. So he's a really interesting one, I think, as well, because of his relationship with national identity in Ireland as well. And I think that's where I bring in William of Orange, because he's also a figure that's, for many people, a really important national icon. And there's this really interesting narrative of, it's almost like you can't suggest that a national icon might have been queer or gay or whatever, or bisexual. You can't say that, because that somehow demeans their heroic identity or whatever. I think for us, I keep bringing it back to William, I'm sorry, it's just because I know the most about him on this subject, but we really want to work more closely with British unionist groups in Northern Ireland, for example, who really revere William of Orange, and try to discuss the queering of his identity with them. And I also think that for us at Hillsborough anyway, we brought in LGBTQ plus groups and asked them to identify images and paintings that jumped out. And William of Orange is one that jumped out, not because it's William of Orange, but because it's a painting of him as a young boy wearing a dress, which is a really different perspective of William of Orange as well. Richard Leary makes a really good point. Jeff Dudgeon has talked about Roger Casement, and he has a really good book about the Black Diaries as well that I would recommend reading, because my knowledge isn't that great, if I'm honest.
Well, I think Jeff Dudgeon has the wonderful way of putting it, which is, about 80% of it is about the weather and is about just mundane things about travel. Why would somebody fake 80% of a diary and not have and just have like 15% about the sexual proclivities of a particular person? So therefore, it must be true. But also, I think Jeff Dudgeon also called Roger Casement a busy homosexual as well, which I think is a wonderful way to put it. But I think this is sort of helping to answer the question that Carmel was also thinking about around the Easter Rising as well. So, I mean, we do have a wonderful expert on our steering group as well. So Dominic Bouchard was on the one of the people on the UN committee that specialized in the history of Northern Ireland as well, and to look at the way in which we can tell these stories. And to Carmel as well, the Casement Diary is actually in the National Archive at the moment as well, on microfilm. So it is, well, in theory, visitable, and you can actually see them. And what's remarkable about them as well is because it's on microfilm now, the page has gone black with white text, so it actually has become the Black Diaries. But you recently caught up with Dominic Bouchard, because her presence in Northern Ireland and the way that we look at queer history in Northern Ireland is quite strong, isn't it, Kris?
Yeah, it is. I'm doing a bit of research at the minute into a sort of timeline of LGBTQ plus practice at museums and heritage sites in Northern Ireland. And one of the earliest things I could find was from 2008. I actually it was from Outburst Queer Arts Festival, which is fabulous. And it was an event called Telling Tales, which I will show you, which was held at the Lidenhall Library. And Dominique Bouchard worked for Mid-Antrim Museum Services at the time, and she was one of the speakers, alongside, I think it was Tony Walsh from the Irish Queer Archive. It's going to bother me now that I can't find the names. But anyway, it was one of the first instances that I came across of people talking about how do we archive LGBT history? How do we tell these stories? How do we collect these stories? And Dominique has worked both in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So she has a really, really great insight into both spaces, but also the connection between the two places. And I think that is one of the things that I'm really excited about with the network, because, and that's the reason I focused on the regional variances section selfishly, because I think the spaces within the UK, within Ireland, across the globe essentially are so particular, and not just within one country, but within different regions as well. You have all these different lived experiences. You have all these different access to support. Even within a museum context, devolved governments have different levels of control over how the heritage sectors operate. So I think it's really important we try to tease out those nuances, because when it comes to queer programming, we need to understand what the particulars are of those places to be able to do that, if that makes any sense.
It does. And I think that's the thing as well. It also affects the way that the organization is able to make their collection accessible as well. So some of the conversations that I was having with the organizations coming in was to do with organizations that were directly local government funded, so local council funded. And they are kind of stuck behind a firewall. Their collections are stuck behind a firewall. So one of the things that is wanting to be discussed is how do we make sure that what we've got is accessible by everybody? So because of the way that the setup of the specifics of that particular collections database is set up, it's not able to be put online. It means that no one will think to kind of go, oh, well, how do I, where can I find the history of this particular community? And that's something that I think desperately needs to be overcome over the coming years. And there are initiatives that will help us do that. But I also wanted to pick up the idea of the community archive as well. And, you know, we've got Richard O'Leary in the session at the moment, and he's talking about LGBT history, Northern Ireland. That's at LGBT History NI. And he also says, Kris, you didn't read this one out. He says that your tour at Hillsborough is fabulous. But we've got Richard in the conversation, but we've also got the team who are at Cork and the Cork Community Archive wanting to get on board as well, and we'd love to engage with them. And so I wanted to have a thought from you perhaps as to how might a organization like ours, how might we be best working with community archives?
Yeah, well, I think a first step is to have that conversation with those groups around how they want their identity and their stories to be collected and how we can support that. Because I know that I'm very, very guilty because a lot of my work has been done with like a big organization like HRP, and maybe it's the same for you, I don't know, but being at the V&A, it's very easy sometimes to forget that the experience of working for a big organization is not the same for smaller organizations and certainly for smaller groups. And it's not just with funding, but it's also with that pastoral support and the encouragement. I think with community collecting, that is probably the most important approach that should be taken. There was a really fabulous project done, and it was initially held at the Museum of Free Derry, which was the Queering the North exhibition. And it was just a really, really gorgeous example of telling stories from a group of people who were engaged in activism in Northern Ireland to seek decriminalization of homosexuality, essentially. And I think that was a really powerful example of how that can be done well. It's something certainly community engagement and work with community groups is something that I really want to do more of, especially those groups that aren't specifically included. Sorry, bit of background noise there. Particularly those groups that aren't represented. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, we have an LGBT farmers group, which I think is fabulous, and they come from really rural communities. And I think it's the same across Ireland, but certainly here, the western part of the country is often excluded from certain narratives, or certainly access to those groups or for those groups is much more difficult. So again, it pulls it back to those regional variances, understanding, okay, well, what are these groups facing and how can we support them? Like, I don't know if you have any thoughts on the community side of things.
I do, because I think it's a useful springboard to talk about the fact that the funding that we've received. Now, it is something that we need to kind of there's still paperwork to fill in, and also make sure that it's all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. But a strong part of what we want to achieve over the next 2 years is to make sure that the support is across the UK, and we also are connecting with organisations beyond the UK. And so I think a lot of the initial work that we're going to be doing is with areas that aren't that can actually connect to those rural and regional areas. A case study that I might present right now is how we're going to work with the Cornwall Museums partnership, which is a partnership of 7 museums in Cornwall, and how that is going to connect us with, the cities of Cornwall, but also deeper into the rural regional areas as well. And I think that's going to be a really key part of this work. It is making sure that we are being able to transfer the research and transfer, in this case, part of the funding as well into these communities, and actually work with them to kind of work out what is it that you actually need on the ground right now, where are you right now, and what is best for us to support you with in terms of working from a perspective of being a gallery, library, archival museum. And I think that's going to be really exciting, and it's something that we're going to get stuck into as soon as we can. And I think that that's the strength of this particular project, the Queer Heritage Collections Network. It is the ability to be quite flexible, because we are a group of organizations and we seek to grow that group of organizations. Our steering group certainly will become, it'll go beyond the 5 founding partners. You know, we'll start to have representation across the board. And that means that we can have a viewpoint that's not just from sort of a national organization or from local council organization. It's going to be a mix of all different types, and include community archives, and also include freelance researchers and independent researchers. I mean, your work to support us is pivotal. And it is you're doing it as part of the research centre for museums and galleries. And of course, we've also got Lucy, who is based in Cardiff, who is a PhD candidate as well, just about to finish up. And I think that the perspective that an independent researcher can provide as well, I think is vital in terms of providing a very different set of viewpoints as well. I've just got it's a wonderful message from Taryn DeVere, who said that I'm watching in my car from Donegal and a big rainbow has lit up the sky. And of course, for me, Taryn is the biggest rainbow that I can think of. Taryn is just such a wonderful, colorful, bright person who just lights up my day every time I have a bit of engagement with Taryn. But we've got a few minutes left. So if you've got any further questions, please do drop them into the chat. But otherwise, I think, Kris, we should start to kind of think about our final takeaway points, which I think if I could volunteer to go first, just so I give you the last word, it is we are at a very exciting point in time, because, well, at some point we'll start to be able to see each other and hug each other again, I hope, in the next couple of years. But for me, it is an exciting point, because the Queer Heritage Collections Network, this new support that we've got is going to, I hope, just completely change the way in which collections are engaging with LGBTQ plus history and heritage, and be able to really strengthen the resolve of organizations and people working on it. You mentioned the pastoral care. That's something that we'd really like to make sure that we can support, because one of the things that I've heard put to me quite a lot is when somebody starts out on a project, they're not quite emotionally prepared for the intense investment that is required in order to make, because at the very core of everything that we do when it comes to LGBTQ plus history and heritage, it's about establishing trust with the community around us, and it's about reaching out and saying, you can trust us to tell us your stories, we will record them, we will preserve them, we will celebrate them, we will cherish them. And that's something that I think is really important. So how do we ensure that the people working on this are given a sense of pastoral care as well? And the co-project manager of this project, Rachel Lennon, is very, very keen on the importance of making sure that mentorships and mentoring, a very strong mentoring program, is a really strong part of this. And then being able to ensure that people just are ready to take on this work. It is exciting work. When you do it right, the response that you get is thrilling. If you go back to the idea of that, the first picture that I've got of people coming into the organization, engaging with you, having fun with you. I invited everybody to sort of, on the anniversary of the Pride celebrations, the Stonewall riots, in fact, I invited that 100 bodies of people to shout the word queer, so it shook the foundations of the museum. And that's exciting things to do when you've got those people with you, but it is really about establishing trust to start off with. So if you're seeking to join us on the journey, please do get in touch with us, because we'd love to have your organization with us. Kris, I think you can have the final 5 minutes to give us your thoughts, please.
I suppose just to reiterate what Dan is saying, I think that it really is a really exciting time for the development of this work. I think there is a fabulous network that also exists in Ireland that is looking to do very similar work. That's run by Judith Finlay and Kate Drennan, and I think that there's so much that can be learned from one another in how we go about doing this. And I think from doing the literature review in particular, it has shown me how far we've come, even in the past 5 years with this work. And the rate at which this work is developing is growing, and so we'll be even further along in less time. And I think that I would encourage everybody who's interested to have a read through the literature review and to pluck out the bits that are of interest to you, but just to know that there is support out there. There are guidelines and there are pathways towards doing this work. And if you ever have fears or doubts, that might not be something that you can do in your space. I think if I can introduce queer narratives to Hillsborough Castle, anyone can introduce queer narratives anywhere, and anybody as part of this network is more than happy to help and support and advise in how you go about doing that. Because I know that a lot of museums across Ireland, across the UK, are small, and they're small teams, and it's a lot of pressure and a lot of work to take on that by yourself. And I think that I'm really excited about what way we're going, and that's the main point of this network. It's to help and support and help other people to grow. So reach out, ask, and yeah, we're here.
Fabulous. Thank you, Kris. I'm just going to read out some of the final comments, which is Emily said, fantastic talk. Thank you very much. Becky has said, this has been so interesting. Thank you both. I'm just going to say this is Gaga. So hello, Gaga. Fascinating talk from you both. Thank you very much. Great to hear all about all the amazing work being done. I've got one final question from Carmel, and if I can set homework for you all. Carmel has said, can I ask, given the word was used, queer, if that's an acceptable part of the narrative? And this is something that, it's in our name. And so for us, it is certainly an acceptable part of the narrative because of that rich history, 100 years in which the word queer has been used as self-identification, in which people sort of say, I am queer. That's certainly one part of the reason why. The fact that it's a sense of liberation for many using it, going back through decades and decades. But I do invite you to read the opening pages from Queer British Art from Claire Barlow, who is a great friend of the network, certainly, and has just given a lecture at the V&A's Queer History of Objects about this very word. If you kind of read the very first sort of pages 11 to 18, I think, it's a really good grounding as to why academically and also in terms of art history, it's a really important word to be using, and also socially as well. So I hope that's helped answer that. A few last comments in. Laura saying it's a fascinating discussion, and also Molly saying it's been really inspiring. Thank you so much. Last thoughts from you, Kris?
No, that's great. And the language stuff is the very first section of the literature review, because it's something people always ask us. So I reference Claire Barlow's work, and it's fabulous. So do read that too.
Brilliant. So I think that's a wonderful place to end by sort of saying we love Claire Barlow, and also we love all organizations engaging in LGBTQ plus history and heritage. What you're doing is amazing. Please carry on. Thank you.
Thank you.